Question 1. To address the challenge of accurately assessing an applicant's understanding of Kentucky's concealed, carry deadly weapons, CCDW licensing requirements, consider the following scenario. An applicant for a CCDW license states that they occasionally carry a utility knife for work purposes. They are concerned that possessing this utility knife might prevent them from obtaining their license. Based on Kentucky revised statutes, how should this concern be addressed? Option A. The applicant should be advised that while a utility knife itself is not a deadly weapon, carrying it in certain locations, such as schools or courthouses, would be prohibited, and they need to be aware of these restrictions. Option B. The applicant should be told that to ensure compliance, they should surrender their utility knife to the licensing authority before their application can be processed. Option C. The applicant's concern is unfounded, as a utility knife is specifically excluded from the definition of a deadly weapon under Kentucky law, and therefore its possession does not impact their eligibility for a CCDW license. Option D. The applicant should be informed that any item capable of causing harm, including a utility knife, is considered a deadly weapon under CCDW law, and they must cease carrying it to be eligible for a license. Correct answer is C. The applicant's concern is unfounded, as a utility knife is specifically excluded from the definition of a deadly weapon under Kentucky law, and therefore its possession does not impact their eligibility for a CCDW license. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to accurately recall and apply specific Kentucky revised statutes, KRS, concerning the definition of deadly weapon and the permissible locations for carrying a concealed deadly weapon, even when the item in question is not a firearm. Misinterpreting the definition or the location restrictions can lead to an applicant being denied a concealed, carry deadly weapons, CCDW, license, or worse, facing criminal charges if they carry a weapon illegally. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between items that are explicitly defined as deadly weapons and those that are not, and to understand the nuances of prohibited carry locations. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of KRS 237-110, which defines deadly weapon and outlines prohibited carry locations. Specifically, the statute defines a deadly weapon as any knife other than a utility knife, or any sword, dagger, dirk, razor, stiletto, or gun, pistol, or other deadly weapon of like kind. It also specifies that a person with a CCDW license may not carry a deadly weapon in certain locations, including any police station, sheriff's office, or state police station, any detention facility, prison, or jail, any courthouse, any meeting of the fiscal court or local legislative body, any school, high school, or university, or any elementary school. The applicant's understanding of the law must be precise. Therefore, correctly identifying their utility knife, by statutory definition, is not considered a deadly weapon for the purposes of CCDW licensing, and thus its possession does not violate the law, is the accurate and legally sound conclusion. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any sharp object capable of causing harm is a deadly weapon under the CCDW law. This fails to adhere to the specific statutory definition provided in KRS 237-110, which explicitly excludes utility knives. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the potential for harm rather than the legal definition, leading to an overbroad interpretation of what constitutes a deadly weapon. Furthermore, misinterpreting the list of prohibited locations, such as assuming a utility knife is prohibited in all locations where firearms are prohibited, demonstrates a lack of understanding of the specific statutes governing concealed carry. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a commitment to understanding and applying the letter of the law as written in the Kentucky revised statutes. Applicants should rely on the precise definitions and restrictions provided by the legislature, rather than making assumptions or applying broad interpretations. When in doubt about the classification of an item or the legality of carrying it in a specific location, consulting the relevant statutes or seeking clarification from official sources is paramount. Question 2. The review process indicates that an applicant for a Kentucky Concealed Deadly Weapons License, CCDW, is attempting to understand the scope of items they can legally carry. The applicant believes that any object they could potentially use to inflict harm on another person, such as a heavy-duty flashlight or a sturdy metal cane, should be considered a deadly weapon under the CCDW statute, and therefore permissible to carry concealed if they obtain the license. Based on Kentucky law, What is the most accurate understanding of this situation? Option A. The applicant's focus on potential harm is irrelevant. Only items explicitly listed in the Kentucky Revised Statutes as prohibited weapons can be considered deadly weapons for the purposes of a CCDW license. Option B. The applicant is correct in assuming that any item capable of causing harm is a deadly weapon, and therefore, if they obtain a CCDW license, they can carry such items concealed without further restriction. Option C. The applicant's interpretation is correct. If an item can be used to inflict harm, it is automatically considered a deadly weapon under Kentucky's CCDW law, regardless of its primary purpose or legal classification. Option D. The applicant must understand that deadly weapon is defined by Kentucky law, and while some items not explicitly listed might be considered deadly weapons based on their design or use, the applicant's personal assessment of potential harm is not the sole determinant. Adherence to statutory definitions and prohibitions is paramount. The correct answer is D. The applicant must understand that deadly weapon is defined by Kentucky law, and while some items not explicitly listed might be considered deadly weapons based on their design or use, the applicant's personal assessment of potential harm is not the sole determinant. Adherence to statutory definitions and prohibitions is paramount. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the nuances of Kentucky's concealed carry laws, specifically concerning the definition of deadly weapon and the permissible locations for carrying such a weapon. Misinterpreting these regulations can lead to serious legal consequences, including denial of the license or criminal charges. The applicant's subjective interpretation of an item's potential for harm, without considering its legal classification, creates a significant risk. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to strictly adhere to the legal definitions and restrictions outlined in Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, Chapter 237, which governs the Concealed Deadly Weapons License, CCDW. This involves understanding what the law explicitly defines as a deadly weapon and recognizing that carrying items not legally classified as such, even if potentially dangerous, does not fall under the purview of the CCDW license requirements for carrying those specific items. The applicant must ensure their understanding aligns with the statutory definitions and prohibitions, rather than personal assumptions about an item's lethality. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal framework governing the CCDW license, ensuring compliance and avoiding violation. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves the applicant assuming that any item capable of causing harm, regardless of its legal classification, is considered a deadly weapon under the CCDW statute. This is a regulatory failure because Kentucky law provides specific definitions for what constitutes a deadly weapon for the purposes of concealed carry. Relying on a subjective interpretation of potential harm, rather than the statutory definition, can lead to confusion and potential violations if the applicant then attempts to carry an item that is not legally defined as a deadly weapon, but is perceived as such by them, or conversely, fails to recognize an item that is legally defined as a deadly weapon. Another incorrect approach is for the applicant to believe that if an item is not explicitly listed in the Kentucky Revised Statutes as a prohibited weapon, it is permissible to carry it concealed under a CCDW license, even if it is a commonly understood deadly weapon. This is a regulatory failure because the statutes provide a definition of deadly weapon that encompasses a broader category than just explicitly listed items. The applicant must understand the general definition and its implications, not just a list of prohibited items. A further incorrect approach is for the applicant to focus solely on the intent behind carrying an item, believing that if they do not intend to use it as a weapon, it is permissible to carry it concealed, regardless of its classification. While intent can be a factor in some criminal offenses, the CCDW license is governed by specific statutes that define what can and cannot be carried, irrespective of the carrier's immediate intent. This is a regulatory failure as it bypasses the statutory requirements for what constitutes a deadly weapon and the conditions under which it can be carried. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a systematic approach to understanding and applying Kentucky's concealed carry laws. This involves 1. Thoroughly studying the Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, Chapter 237, paying close attention to definitions of deadly weapon and prohibited locations. 2. Seeking clarification from official sources, such as the Kentucky State Police or legal counsel, when any aspect of the law is unclear. 3. Applying the law objectively, based on statutory definitions and prohibitions, rather than personal interpretations or assumptions. 4. Recognizing that the CCDW license is a privilege granted under specific legal conditions, and adherence to those conditions is paramount. Question 3. Examination of the data shows that a Kentucky resident who has recently obtained their concealed carry of deadly weapons license, CCDW, is seeking to understand the precise legal boundaries of where they can carry their concealed firearm. They recall hearing various opinions from peers and have seen some general information online. To ensure they are acting within the law, what is the most appropriate and legally sound method for this individual to determine the specific locations where carrying a concealed deadly weapon is prohibited under Kentucky law? Option A. Base their understanding of prohibited locations on personal opinions regarding gun rights and perceived societal norms. Option B. Rely on the advice and interpretations of friends and acquaintances who also own firearms and have CCDW licenses. Option C. Directly consult the Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, specifically KRS 237-110, which details the regulations and prohibited places for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. Option D. Assume that the CCDW license permits carrying a concealed deadly weapon in all public spaces, as long as it is not actively brandished. The correct answer is C. Directly consult the Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, specifically KRS 237-110, which details the regulations and prohibited places for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuanced requirements of Kentucky's Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons License, CCDW, laws, while also considering the ethical implications of their actions. The core challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the law to a specific situation, ensuring that one's conduct remains within legal boundaries and upholds responsible firearm ownership principles. The potential for misinterpretation or overreach necessitates careful judgment. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and direct review of the Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, pertaining to concealed carry, specifically focusing on KRS 237-110, which outlines the requirements and restrictions for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal framework governing the CCDW license. By consulting the statutes, the individual ensures their understanding is based on the precise language of the law, minimizing the risk of misinterpretation and ensuring compliance with all stipulated conditions for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. This is the most reliable method for accurate legal interpretation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves relying solely on informal advice from friends or acquaintances. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the authoritative source of legal information. Such advice is often based on personal interpretation, hearsay, or outdated information, and lacks the legal weight necessary for compliance. It fails to adhere to the specific mandates of Kentucky law, potentially leading to violations. Another incorrect approach is to assume that possessing a CCDW license automatically grants permission to carry a deadly weapon in all locations. This is professionally unacceptable as Kentucky law, as detailed in KRS 237-110, explicitly lists numerous prohibited locations where carrying a concealed deadly weapon is illegal, regardless of license status. This approach demonstrates a failure to understand the limitations and specific restrictions imposed by the statute. A further incorrect approach is to interpret the law based on personal opinions or beliefs about gun rights. This is professionally unacceptable because legal compliance requires adherence to established statutes, not subjective interpretations. Personal beliefs do not supersede the specific requirements and prohibitions outlined in KRS 237-110, and acting on such beliefs can lead to illegal conduct. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing situations involving legal compliance, particularly concerning firearms, should adopt a systematic decision-making process. This process begins with identifying the relevant legal framework, in this case, Kentucky's CCDW laws. The next step is to consult the primary legal sources, such as the Kentucky Revised Statutes, to gain an accurate understanding of the requirements, restrictions, and prohibitions. If ambiguity remains, seeking clarification from official sources, such as the Kentucky State Police or legal counsel specializing in firearms law, is advisable. This methodical approach ensures actions are grounded in legal fact, not assumption or informal advice, thereby upholding professional responsibility and legal adherence. Question 4. Upon reviewing the posted signage at the entrance of a private restaurant in Louisville, Kentucky, you notice a small, somewhat faded sign that appears to indicate a policy against firearms. You are a licensed Kentucky concealed carry deadly weapon CCDW holder. What is the most prudent course of action to ensure compliance with Kentucky law and respect for the establishment's property rights? Option A. Immediately leave the premises without further interaction, deciding the risk of potential conflict is too high. Option B. Discreetly approach the restaurant manager or a staff member at the counter and politely inquire about their specific policy regarding concealed firearms for licensed individuals. Option C. Assume that your valid CCDW license overrides any general signage and proceed to enter the restaurant with your concealed weapon. Option D. Verbally question the validity of the signage with the nearest employee, asserting your right to carry as a licensed individual. The correct answer is B. Discreetly approach the restaurant manager or a staff member at the counter and politely inquire about their specific policy regarding concealed firearms for licensed individuals. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the licensee to exercise discretion and judgment in a situation where their right to carry a concealed deadly weapon intersects with the rights and safety of others in a private establishment. The licensee must balance their legal right to carry with the establishment's right to set its own rules regarding weapons on their premises, all while ensuring public safety and avoiding unnecessary escalation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves discreetly and politely inquiring with the establishment's management or security personnel about their policy on concealed carry. This approach is correct because it respects the private property rights of the establishment and allows for a clear understanding of their rules before any potential conflict arises. Kentucky law, while granting the right to carry a concealed deadly weapon with a valid CCDW license, does not supersede private property owners' rights to prohibit firearms on their premises. KRS 237-110 outlines the requirements for obtaining a CCDW license and the general rights conferred, but it also acknowledges exceptions and prohibitions, including those by private property owners. This proactive communication demonstrates responsibility and adherence to both the letter and spirit of the law, as well as respect for private business operations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that having a valid CCDW license automatically grants permission to carry a concealed weapon into any establishment, regardless of posted signs or verbal policies. This fails to acknowledge the rights of private property owners to regulate conduct on their premises and could lead to a violation of trespass laws or the establishment's specific policies, even if not explicitly a violation of the CCDW statute itself. Another incorrect approach is to immediately confront or question the establishment's policy, especially in a manner that could be perceived as aggressive or confrontational. This escalates the situation unnecessarily, potentially creating a disturbance and jeopardizing the licensee's own safety and reputation, as well as that of others. It disregards the principle of de-escalation and respectful interaction. A further incorrect approach is to ignore any potential signage or verbal indications of a weapon's prohibition and proceed to carry the concealed weapon into the establishment. This directly violates the property owner's right to prohibit firearms and could result in being asked to leave, facing legal consequences for trespass, or even having the CCDW license reviewed by the Kentucky State Police if the incident is reported and deemed a serious infraction. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes awareness, communication, and de-escalation. First, they should be observant of their surroundings, looking for any posted signage regarding weapons policies. Second, if unsure or if there is no clear signage, they should discreetly and politely seek clarification from management or security. Third, they must be prepared to comply with the establishment's policy, even if it means leaving the weapon secured elsewhere, to avoid conflict and uphold legal and ethical responsibilities. This approach ensures compliance with Kentucky law, respects private property rights, and promotes a safe and orderly environment. Question 5. When evaluating a situation where an individual with a Kentucky concealed carry deadly weapons (CCDW) license is confronted by an aggressive, verbally abusive person in a public place, what is the most legally sound and professionally responsible course of action to take regarding their concealed handgun? Option A. Abandon the current location immediately by fleeing the premises without assessing the immediate safety of egress. Option B. Remain calm. Avoid any actions that could be perceived as threatening, and only draw the handgun if there is an immediate and overt threat of serious physical harm or death. Option C. Draw the handgun from its concealed position and hold it in a ready-to-use stance to deter the aggressive individual. Option D. Immediately engage in a heated verbal exchange with the aggressive individual to assert dominance and de-escalate the situation through intimidation. The correct answer is B. Remain calm, avoid any actions that could be perceived as threatening, and only draw the handgun if there is an immediate and overt threat of serious physical harm or death. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the strict legal requirements for carrying a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these regulations can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the revocation of their CCDW license. The challenge lies in understanding the nuances of what constitutes a lawful carry and when a weapon may be brandished or used. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves understanding that a Kentucky CCDW license permits the concealed carry of a handgun. However, it does not grant the right to brandish or display the weapon in a threatening manner unless there is an immediate threat of serious physical harm or death. Therefore, the most appropriate action is to remain calm, avoid any actions that could be perceived as threatening, and only draw the weapon if absolutely necessary for self-defense against an imminent threat. This aligns with KRS 527-020, which outlines the conditions under which carrying a concealed deadly weapon is permitted and the exceptions to unlawful display. The license holder's primary responsibility is to carry lawfully and use the weapon only as a last resort in self-defense. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to draw the handgun from its concealed position and hold it in a ready-to-use stance simply because of a perceived threat or aggressive verbal exchange. This action, without an immediate and overt threat of serious physical harm or death, could be construed as unlawful brandishing or display of a deadly weapon under Kentucky law, potentially leading to criminal charges and jeopardizing the CCDW license. Another incorrect approach is to immediately engage verbally with the aggressive individual, escalating the confrontation. Communication is important. Doing so in a manner that further provokes the situation, especially while carrying a concealed weapon, increases the risk of the situation deteriorating into a physical altercation where the weapon might be unlawfully deployed. The focus should be on de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation. A third incorrect approach is to leave the premises immediately without assessing the situation or ensuring personal safety. While avoidance is generally a good strategy, abruptly fleeing might not always be feasible or safe, especially if the aggressive individual pursues or blocks the exit. Furthermore, if the individual has a lawful right to be in that location, abandoning their position without cause might not be the most prudent response, especially if the threat is not immediate and the individual is not in a position to safely disengage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, de-escalation, and strict adherence to legal statutes. This involves a rapid assessment of the threat level, understanding the legal boundaries of self-defense and weapon display, and choosing the least confrontational yet safest course of action. The core principle is to avoid escalating a situation, and to only resort to the use of deadly force as an absolute last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, as defined by Kentucky law. Question 6. The analysis reveals that an applicant for a concealed deadly weapon license, CCDW, in Kentucky has a past arrest for assault, which was later dismissed by the prosecutor. The applicant has no other criminal history. Which of the following approaches best reflects the appropriate professional and legal standard for evaluating this applicant's fitness to carry a concealed deadly weapon? Option A. Deny the CCDW license based on the arrest alone as it suggests a potential for violence, even if not proven in court. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the circumstances surrounding the dismissed assault charge, considering the applicant's overall history and character, to determine if it indicates a present unsuitability for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. Option C. Grant the CCDW license without further investigation, assuming the dismissal signifies no issue with the applicant's character. Option D. Automatically deny the CCDW license due to the presence of an arrest for assault, regardless of the dismissal. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the circumstances surrounding the dismissed assault charge, considering the applicant's overall history and character, to determine if it indicates a present unsuitability for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. Explanation: the analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between an individual's right to self-defense and the strict legal requirements for carrying a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky. The applicant's past behavior, while not resulting in a disqualifying conviction, raises concerns about judgment and temperament, which are critical factors in assessing fitness for a concealed deadly weapon license, CCDW. Careful judgment is required to balance the presumption of innocence with the state's interest in public safety. The correct approach involves a thorough, individualized assessment of the applicant's entire history, focusing on the specific circumstances of the past incident and its relevance to the applicant's current fitness to carry a concealed deadly weapon. This approach prioritizes adherence to Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, Chapter 237, specifically KRS 237-110, which outlines the grounds for disqualification. The licensing authority must consider whether the past incident, even without a conviction, demonstrates a propensity for violence, poor judgment, or an inability to exercise restraint, all of which are implicitly relevant to the safe and responsible carrying of a deadly weapon. This individualized review ensures that decisions are based on a comprehensive understanding of the applicant's character and potential risk, rather than a rigid, one-size-fits-all interpretation. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely because of the past arrest, regardless of the outcome or the specific details. This fails to acknowledge that an arrest is not a conviction, and that individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Such an approach would violate the principle of due process and could lead to the arbitrary denial of rights. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the past incident entirely, assuming that the absence of a conviction means it has no bearing on the applicant's suitability. This would be a dereliction of the licensing authority's duty to ensure public safety by failing to consider all relevant information that might indicate a risk. Finally, an approach that relies on subjective bias or personal feelings about the applicant's appearance or demeanor, rather than objective legal criteria and factual evidence, is also professionally unacceptable and ethically unsound. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the statutory requirements for licensure and disqualification. This framework necessitates a diligent investigation into the applicant's background, including any arrests, charges, and their resolutions. The focus should always be on whether the totality of the circumstances, as evidenced by the applicant's history, demonstrates a lack of good moral character or a propensity for behavior that would endanger the public if they were armed. This involves weighing the nature of any past incidents against the applicant's subsequent conduct and overall record, ensuring that decisions are fair, consistent, and grounded in the law and public safety. Question 7. Comparative studies suggest that individuals licensed to carry concealed deadly weapons, CCDW, in Kentucky may encounter situations in public spaces where they feel uneasy or perceive potential threats. Considering the specific provisions of Kentucky Revised Statutes concerning the justifiable use of force and the requirements for a CCDW license, what is the most legally sound and professionally responsible course of action for a licensee who feels they are being watched or followed in a crowded shopping mall, but has not yet witnessed any overt act of aggression or direct threat of death or serious physical injury? Option A. Draw the concealed weapon and openly display it to deter any potential aggressors, believing that visible possession of the weapon will discourage any harmful intentions. Option B. Continue to carry the weapon concealed as permitted by the license, remain situationally aware, and avoid any actions that could be construed as threatening or escalate the situation, unless an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury arises. Option C. Leave the shopping mall immediately and report the feeling of unease to mall security without taking any other action regarding the concealed weapon. Option D. Approach individuals who appear suspicious and verbally confront them, making a veiled reference to being armed for self-protection. The correct answer is B. Continue to carry the weapon concealed as permitted by the license, remain situationally aware, and avoid any actions that could be construed as threatening or escalate the situation, unless an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury arises. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Kentucky's concealed carry laws in a situation where personal safety might be perceived as compromised. But the legal framework for carrying a deadly weapon is strict. The challenge lies in balancing the right to self-defense with the legal obligations and restrictions imposed by the Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, concerning concealed deadly weapons. Misinterpreting these statutes can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the revocation of a CCDW license. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions taken are in full compliance with the law, even under perceived duress. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to the Kentucky Revised Statutes governing concealed carry. This means recognizing that a CCDW license permits carrying a concealed deadly weapon, but it does not grant carte blanche to display or use such a weapon in situations that do not meet the legal threshold for self-defense as defined by Kentucky law. Specifically, KRS 503.050 outlines the justifiable use of force, including deadly force, which requires an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury. Therefore, carrying a concealed weapon in a public place, even if feeling uneasy, is permissible with a valid license, but drawing or brandishing it without meeting the legal criteria for self-defense is a violation. The correct approach is to maintain possession of the weapon concealed, as permitted by the license, and to avoid any actions that could be construed as threatening or as an unlawful display of a weapon, unless the immediate threat of death or serious physical injury necessitates it under KRS 503.050. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to draw the concealed weapon and openly display it to deter potential threats, even without an immediate, overt act of aggression. This fails to comply with the principle that a CCDW license is for concealed carry. Openly displaying a weapon without justification can be considered brandishing, which is a separate offense and can lead to the revocation of a CCDW license and criminal charges, irrespective of the licensee's subjective feelings of unease. It escalates the situation unnecessarily and can be interpreted as an unlawful threat. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a feeling of being watched or a general sense of unease in a public place automatically justifies drawing and brandishing the concealed weapon. Kentucky law requires an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury to justify the use of deadly force or the display of a weapon in a manner that could be perceived as threatening. Subjective feelings, while valid personal experiences, do not meet the objective legal standard for self-defense. This approach risks criminal charges for assault or menacing. A further incorrect approach is to conceal the weapon, but then verbally confront individuals who are perceived as suspicious, making reference to the concealed weapon. While verbal confrontation might seem like a way to de-escalate or assert oneself, referencing a concealed weapon without a direct threat of imminent harm can be interpreted as intimidation or a threat, potentially leading to legal repercussions. The focus of a CCDW license is on concealed carry for self-defense, not for aggressive public engagement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and de-escalation. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal parameters of their CCDW license and the justifiable use of force in Kentucky. 2. Assessing the situation objectively, looking for imminent threats rather than relying solely on subjective feelings. 3. If a threat is imminent and meets the legal threshold, acting decisively and lawfully to defend oneself. 4. If no imminent threat exists, maintaining a concealed weapon as permitted and avoiding any actions that could escalate the situation or be construed as unlawful. 5. Prioritizing situational awareness and avoidance of potentially dangerous situations whenever possible. Question 8. The investigation demonstrates that an applicant for a Kentucky Concealed Carry Deadly Weapons License, CCDW, has a prior conviction for a misdemeanor offense of disorderly conduct from 5 years ago. The court record simply states disorderly conduct without further elaboration on the specific actions that led to the conviction. Considering Kentucky's statutory requirements for CCDW licensing, what is the most appropriate next step for the licensing authority? Option A. Automatically deny the license application because any misdemeanor conviction is a disqualifying factor. Option B. Grant the license immediately, assuming that disorderly conduct is not a serious enough offense to warrant disqualification. Option C. Request certified court records to determine if the specific disorderly conduct conviction involved the use of force against a person, as per KRS 237, 110(7)(a). Option D. Rely on the applicant's verbal assurance that the incident was minor and did not involve any violence. The correct answer is C. Request certified court records to determine if the specific disorderly conduct conviction involved the use of force against a person, as per KRS 237, 110(7)(a). Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario where an applicant for a Kentucky Concealed Carry Deadly Weapons License, CCDW, has a past conviction for a misdemeanor offense that may or may not be considered a disqualifying offense under Kentucky law. The challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of KRS 237, 110, which outlines the disqualifications for a CCDW license, particularly concerning offenses that involve the use of force or the potential for violence. A careful judgment is required to determine if the applicant's specific conviction falls within the scope of these disqualifications, balancing public safety with an individual's right to self-defense. Correct approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's criminal record in conjunction with the specific language of Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS 237, 110. This approach requires understanding that not all misdemeanor convictions automatically disqualify an applicant. Instead, the nature of the offense and its relation to the use of force or potential for violence are paramount. Specifically, KRS 237, 110(7)(a) disqualifies individuals convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor involving the use of force against a person. The investigation must ascertain if the applicant's misdemeanor conviction, as documented by the court, involved the use of force against a person. If the conviction does not explicitly state or clearly imply the use of force against a person, further inquiry or a determination based on the statute's intent is necessary. This approach prioritizes adherence to the precise statutory language and its underlying public safety purpose. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license based solely on the existence of any misdemeanor conviction, without examining its specific nature and whether it involved the use of force against a person. This fails to acknowledge the statutory distinction between various types of misdemeanors and misinterprets the scope of KRS 237, 110(7)(a). Another incorrect approach would be to grant the license without a proper investigation into the details of the misdemeanor conviction, assuming that any conviction not explicitly listed as a felony is permissible. This neglects the critical element of misdemeanor involving the use of force against a person and could compromise public safety. A third incorrect approach would be to rely on informal interpretations or hearsay regarding the applicant's past rather than seeking official court records and applying the statute directly. This introduces an unacceptable level of subjectivity and potential for error. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant statutes, particularly KRS 237, 110. This involves meticulously reviewing the applicant's submitted information and any accompanying documentation. When ambiguities arise regarding the nature of a past offense, the professional should seek clarification through official channels, such as requesting certified court records or consulting with legal counsel specializing in firearms law in Kentucky. The decision must be grounded in a direct application of the statutory criteria, prioritizing public safety while respecting the rights afforded by law. Question 9. Analysis of a scenario in Kentucky where an individual carrying a concealed deadly weapon license, CCDW, witnesses a person loitering suspiciously near their parked vehicle in a dimly lit parking lot. The individual feels a sense of unease and believes the person might attempt to break into their car. What is the most appropriate course of action for the CCDW license holder in this situation, adhering strictly to Kentucky law? Option A. Maintain situational awareness, observe the individual's actions from a safe distance, and be prepared to call law enforcement if the suspicious behavior escalates into a direct threat to property or personal safety. Option B. Immediately confront the loitering individual and verbally assert their right to carry a concealed weapon to deter any potential criminal activity. Option C. Approach the individual directly and demand to know their intentions, ready to use their concealed weapon if they do not comply. Option D. Draw their concealed weapon and aim it at the individual to prevent any possible attempt to tamper with the vehicle. The correct answer is A. Maintain situational awareness, observe the individual's actions from a safe distance, and be prepared to call law enforcement if the suspicious behavior escalates into a direct threat to property or personal safety. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of when and how force may be legally justified, and the potential legal ramifications of misjudging a situation. A failure to act within the bounds of Kentucky law can lead to severe criminal charges, even if the individual believes their actions were necessary for self-protection. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Kentucky's laws regarding the use of deadly force. This means recognizing that the legal justification for using deadly force is typically limited to situations where there is an immediate and unavoidable threat of death or serious physical injury to oneself or another person. The individual must be able to articulate, based on the totality of the circumstances, that they reasonably believed such a threat existed. This approach is correct because it aligns directly with KRS 503.050, which outlines the justification for the use of deadly physical force in self-protection, requiring a reasonable belief of imminent danger. It prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility over impulsive reaction. Incorrect approaches analysis. Acting solely on a feeling of unease or a perceived threat without concrete evidence of imminent danger is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Kentucky law does not permit the use of deadly force based on mere apprehension or a subjective feeling of being threatened. This approach violates the principle of proportionality and the requirement for an immediate threat. Escalating a verbal dispute into a physical confrontation and then resorting to the use of a concealed weapon represents a severe failure to de-escalate and a clear violation of the legal justification for self-defense. The law expects individuals to avoid confrontation when possible and only resort to force as a last resort when faced with an unavoidable threat. This approach demonstrates a lack of judgment and a disregard for the legal framework governing the use of deadly force. Using a concealed weapon to prevent a minor property crime, such as someone attempting to steal a bicycle, is also a regulatory and ethical failure. Kentucky law generally does not justify the use of deadly force to protect property alone, especially when there is no immediate threat to life or serious bodily harm. This action would likely be considered excessive force and could lead to criminal charges. Professional reasoning. Professionals carrying a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation, situational awareness, and a clear understanding of legal boundaries. This involves 1. Assessing the immediate threat. Is there an imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm? 2. Considering alternatives. Can the situation be de-escalated or avoided without the use of force? 3. Understanding legal justification. Does the situation meet the strict legal criteria for the use of deadly force in Kentucky? 4. Acting proportionally. If force is necessary, is it the minimum force required to neutralize the threat? 5. Post-incident protocol. If force is used, securing the scene and cooperating with law enforcement while exercising the right to remain silent until legal counsel is present. Question 10. Consider a scenario where a Kentucky Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons (CCDW) licensee has a semi-automatic pistol with a standard magazine capacity of 15 rounds. The licensee has fired 3 rounds from the magazine. What is the remaining ammunition capacity in the magazine? Option A. The magazine is still considered to have 15 rounds until reloaded. Option B. 12 rounds. Option C. Approximately 10-13 rounds. Option D. A visual estimate of the remaining rounds. The correct answer is B. 12 rounds. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge by requiring the licensee to accurately calculate the remaining ammunition capacity of their firearm under a specific, time-sensitive condition. Miscalculation could lead to a misunderstanding of their legal carrying capacity, potentially resulting in a violation of Kentucky's concealed carry laws if they exceed the permitted number of rounds. This demands precision and adherence to the firearm's specifications. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a direct calculation based on the firearm's stated magazine capacity and the number of rounds already fired. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal requirement of knowing the current ammunition status of the concealed weapon. Kentucky law, while not specifying exact calculation methods, implicitly requires a licensee to be aware of their firearm's capacity and current load to avoid exceeding any potential limitations, or to ensure they are not carrying an illegally modified magazine. The calculation is straightforward. Initial capacity minus rounds fired equals remaining capacity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves estimating the remaining ammunition. This is professionally unacceptable because it introduces a margin of error that could lead to a violation. Legal compliance requires certainty, not approximation, when dealing with firearm capacity. Another incorrect approach is to rely on a visual guess of the ammunition level. This is flawed because visual cues can be misleading, especially in a concealed carry situation where quick assessment is needed. It lacks the precision required for legal compliance and safety. A further incorrect approach is to assume the magazine is still at its full capacity without accounting for any rounds fired. This is a direct contravention of responsible firearm handling and legal awareness, as it ignores the operational status of the weapon and could lead to a false sense of security or an unintentional violation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize accuracy and legal compliance. When faced with a situation requiring a calculation related to firearm capacity, the decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the relevant legal parameters, in this case, understanding the firearm's capacity and the implications of carrying a concealed weapon. 2. Utilizing precise, verifiable methods for assessment, direct calculation. 3. Avoiding assumptions or estimations that introduce uncertainty. 4. Ensuring the chosen method aligns with the spirit and letter of the law, which emphasizes responsible and informed carrying of a deadly weapon. Question 11. During the evaluation of a scenario where an individual with a Kentucky concealed carry deadly weapons, CCDW license is approached by an agitated individual in a public parking lot who begins shouting aggressively and gesturing wildly, but has not yet made any physical contact or overt threat of immediate physical harm. Which of the following actions best reflects responsible and legally compliant conduct? Option A. Immediately display the concealed weapon to deter the agitated individual from further aggression. Option B. Assume the agitated individual intends to cause harm and prepare to use the concealed weapon if they come within arm's reach. Option C. Maintain situational awareness, create distance if possible, and avoid engaging with the agitated individual, seeking to leave the area if safe to do so. Option D. Engage verbally with the agitated individual to de-escalate the situation through assertive communication. The correct answer is C. Maintain situational awareness, create distance if possible, and avoid engaging with the agitated individual, seeking to leave the area if safe to do so. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of when and how force may be legally justified, and the potential legal ramifications of misinterpreting these guidelines. Careful judgment is required to avoid escalating a situation unnecessarily or using force inappropriately, which could lead to severe legal consequences. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever possible. This approach prioritizes personal safety through situational awareness and a commitment to not engaging in disputes that do not pose an immediate threat. If confronted, the focus remains on creating distance and seeking to disengage from the situation without resorting to the use of a concealed weapon. This aligns with the principles of responsible firearm ownership and the legal standards for self-defense in Kentucky, which generally require a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm before deadly force is justified. The Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, Chapter 503, concerning justification of the use of force, emphasizes that deadly force is permissible only when necessary to prevent death or serious physical injury. Therefore, avoiding a confrontation that does not meet this threshold is the most legally sound and ethically responsible course of action. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately displaying the concealed weapon upon feeling threatened, but before any overt act of aggression. This action could be interpreted as an escalation of the situation and an attempt to intimidate, rather than a response to an imminent threat, potentially violating KRS 503.050, which outlines the use of physical force in self-protection. Another incorrect approach is to engage verbally with the aggressor in a manner that provokes further conflict, thereby escalating the situation and potentially creating a scenario where the use of force, even if later justified, becomes more complex to defend legally. This fails to prioritize de-escalation and avoidance. Finally, an incorrect approach is to assume that the mere presence of a concealed weapon grants the right to use it in any perceived threat, regardless of the immediacy or severity of the danger. This misunderstands the legal standard of imminent danger and the proportionality required for the use of deadly force under Kentucky law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness and de-escalation. This involves constantly assessing the environment for potential threats and actively seeking to avoid confrontations. When a potential threat arises, the immediate goal should be to create distance and disengage. If direct confrontation becomes unavoidable, and there is a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, then the use of a concealed weapon may be considered, but only as a last resort and in accordance with Kentucky law. This framework emphasizes responsible decision-making, legal compliance, and the preservation of life and safety. Question 12. Research into Kentucky's Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons License, CCDW requirements and best practices. If a CCDW license holder observes an individual acting suspiciously in a public park, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Approach the individual directly to ask them what they are doing and if they need assistance. Option B. Maintain a safe distance. Observe the individual's behavior for any immediate threats, and be prepared to take defensive action only if a direct threat to life or serious bodily harm arises. Option C. Immediately draw your concealed weapon to deter any potential criminal activity. Option D. Continue walking past the individual without paying any attention to their actions, assuming it is not your concern. Correct answer is B. Maintain a safe distance. Observe the individual's behavior for any immediate threats, and be prepared to take defensive action only if a direct threat to life or serious bodily harm arises. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the delicate balance between personal safety and legal compliance when encountering a situation that could potentially escalate. The individual must make a judgment call based on their training and understanding of Kentucky law regarding concealed carry, without overreacting or misinterpreting the circumstances. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the immediate threat level and acting within the bounds of the law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves maintaining a safe distance and observing the situation without engaging directly, unless there is an immediate and unavoidable threat to life or serious bodily harm. This approach aligns with the principles of de-escalation and responsible firearm ownership, emphasizing that a concealed deadly weapon is a last resort. Kentucky law, while permitting concealed carry for licensed individuals, does not mandate or encourage its use in situations that can be resolved through observation and avoidance. The focus is on self-defense when absolutely necessary, not on proactive intervention or confrontation. This approach prioritizes personal safety and legal adherence by avoiding unnecessary escalation. Incorrect approaches analysis. Engaging the individual directly to inquire about their intentions or actions, even with the intent to de-escalate, is an inappropriate response. This action could be perceived as confrontational, potentially escalating the situation and creating a threat where none existed. It also bypasses the principle of only using a firearm in direct defense of life or serious bodily harm. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately draw the concealed weapon. This action is a significant escalation and is only legally justifiable under Kentucky law when there is an imminent threat of death or grievous bodily harm. Drawing a weapon without such a threat could lead to legal repercussions and is contrary to responsible firearm practices. Finally, ignoring the situation entirely and continuing to walk past without any situational awareness could be problematic if the observed behavior later results in harm to others, and the individual possessed the means to potentially observe or report it without putting themselves at risk. While avoidance is key, complete disregard for potentially dangerous activity without any observation is not the most prudent approach. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and adherence to legal statutes. This involves observing from a safe distance, evaluating the immediate risk, and only escalating to defensive actions if legally and ethically warranted. The principle of duty to retreat, or, in this context, the duty to avoid confrontation unless absolutely necessary, is paramount. Training should emphasize de-escalation techniques and the legal thresholds for using deadly force. Question 13. The performance metrics show a pattern of licensees in Kentucky drawing their concealed weapons in response to perceived threats that do not always meet the legal threshold for imminent danger. Considering a scenario where an individual is aggressively approaching a licensee in a public place, shouting insults but maintaining a distance of approximately 15 feet, and has no visible weapons, which of the following responses best reflects professional and legal best practices for a Kentucky concealed carry deadly weapons license holder? Option A. Immediately draw the concealed weapon to deter the aggressor and signal readiness to defend oneself. Option B. Engage the aggressor verbally to understand the reason for their aggression and attempt to resolve the conflict through dialogue. Option C. Maintain a safe distance. Verbally de-escalate if possible without escalating the situation, and be prepared to defend oneself if the aggressor closes the distance and poses an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Option D. Retreat from the area immediately, even if it means leaving personal belongings behind, without assessing the immediate threat level. The correct answer is C. Maintain a safe distance. Verbally de-escalate if possible without escalating the situation, and be prepared to defend oneself if the aggressor closes the distance and poses an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the handling of potential threats by licensed individuals in Kentucky. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate judgment under pressure, balancing the right to self-defense with the legal and ethical responsibilities of carrying a deadly weapon. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing a situation to determine if the use of deadly force is legally justified and ethically sound, while also considering the potential consequences of both action and inaction. The best professional practice involves a thorough and objective assessment of the immediate threat to life or serious bodily harm. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of force whenever possible. It requires the licensee to consider all available information, including the aggressor's actions, words, and proximity, as well as the presence of innocent bystanders and escape routes. The legal justification for using deadly force in Kentucky is strictly defined by KRS 503:050, which permits the use of deadly force when a person reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or another person, or to prevent the commission of a felony. This approach aligns with that legal standard by demanding a reasonable belief of imminent danger before resorting to deadly force. Ethically, it upholds the principle of preserving life and minimizing harm, an approach that relies solely on the perceived intent of an individual without concrete actions demonstrating an immediate threat is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the legal standard of a reasonable belief of imminent danger. The law requires more than a subjective feeling of unease. It demands observable actions that create a clear and present danger. Relying on assumptions or past grievances without current, overt threats can lead to unjustified use of force, violating both legal statutes and ethical principles. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to engage in a verbal confrontation or attempt to disarm an individual who has not yet presented an immediate threat of deadly force. While de-escalation is important, initiating or escalating a confrontation when not under immediate threat can create a dangerous situation where deadly force might then become necessary, but the initial engagement was not legally justified. This can also lead to unintended escalation and put the licensee and others at risk. Finally, an approach that involves immediately drawing a concealed weapon upon perceiving any sign of aggression, without a clear and present danger of death or serious bodily harm, is also professionally unacceptable. This action, while a defensive posture, can be interpreted as an escalation and may not meet the legal threshold for the imminent threat required for the justified use of deadly force. It can also create panic and lead to unintended consequences. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and adherence to legal parameters. This involves constantly evaluating the environment, identifying potential threats, and assessing the level of danger. The framework should prioritize de-escalation and avoidance of conflict. If a threat emerges, the licensee must assess whether it constitutes an imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, and whether the use of deadly force is the only reasonable means to prevent such harm, in strict accordance with Kentucky revised statutes. Question 14. The control framework reveals that a Kentucky resident has obtained a concealed carry deadly weapons (CCDW) license. The resident believes that their license allows them to carry any item they personally consider a deadly weapon, and that the license permits concealed carry in all locations within Kentucky, except for those explicitly posted with prohibitive signage. Which approach best aligns with the regulatory requirements for CCDW license holders in Kentucky? Option A. Believing that the CCDW license supersedes any specific location-based restriction as long as the weapon is concealed and the individual is licensed. Option B. Consulting the Kentucky revised statutes to confirm the legal definition of a deadly weapon for CCDW purposes and to identify all statutorily prohibited locations for carrying a concealed handgun. Option C. Assuming that the CCDW license covers all items that could be used to inflict harm and that signage is the primary indicator of prohibited carry locations. Option D. Relying on personal interpretation of what constitutes a deadly weapon, and assuming the license grants broad carry privileges, with prohibitions only where explicitly posted. The correct answer is B. Consulting the Kentucky revised statutes to confirm the legal definition of a deadly weapon for CCDW purposes, and to identify all statutorily prohibited locations for carrying a concealed handgun. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the nuances of Kentucky's concealed carry laws, specifically concerning the definition of deadly weapon and the permissible locations for carrying such a weapon, even when licensed. The applicant's personal interpretation of what constitutes a deadly weapon and their assumption about unrestricted carry rights, despite holding a license, can lead to violations if not grounded in statutory definitions and restrictions. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with KRS 237-110 and related statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding that a Kentucky concealed carry deadly weapons (CCDW) license permits concealed carry of handguns, but not all items that could be considered deadly weapons in a broader sense. It also requires awareness of specific locations where carrying a concealed handgun is prohibited by law, regardless of the license. Therefore, the correct approach is to consult the Kentucky revised statutes, KRS, to confirm the statutory definition of a deadly weapon for the purposes of concealed carry and to identify all statutorily prohibited locations. This ensures the applicant acts within the legal framework established by the state, avoiding potential criminal charges. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that any object capable of causing harm is a deadly weapon under the CCDW license, and that the license grants unrestricted carry rights. This fails to recognize that Kentucky law specifically defines what constitutes a deadly weapon for the purposes of concealed carry, typically focusing on firearms. It also ignores the numerous statutory restrictions on where a licensed individual can carry a concealed handgun, such as in schools, courthouses, or correctional facilities. This approach risks carrying prohibited items or carrying in prohibited places, leading to license revocation and criminal penalties. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on personal interpretation or common understanding of what a deadly weapon is, without referencing the specific legal definitions provided in Kentucky statutes. This can lead to the mistaken belief that items not legally defined as deadly weapons for concealed carry purposes are covered by the license, or conversely, that items legally defined as such are not. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence in understanding the scope and limitations of the CCDW license. A third incorrect approach is to assume that once a CCDW license is obtained, all prior knowledge about firearm safety and legal carry is sufficient, and no further review of Kentucky-specific laws is necessary. This overlooks the fact that laws can change, and that specific prohibitions and requirements are detailed within the Kentucky Revised Statutes. It represents a passive approach to legal compliance rather than an active and informed one. Professional reasoning. Professionals seeking or maintaining a CCDW license in Kentucky should adopt a proactive and informed approach to legal compliance. This involves not only understanding the application process, but also thoroughly familiarizing themselves with the Kentucky Revised Statutes pertaining to concealed carry. This includes the definition of a deadly weapon for CCDW purposes, the specific prohibitions on carrying in certain locations, and the responsibilities that come with carrying a concealed deadly weapon. When in doubt, consulting the official Kentucky Revised Statutes or seeking clarification from law enforcement or legal counsel is the most prudent course of action. Question 15. The performance metrics show a pattern of licensed individuals in Kentucky reacting to perceived threats. In a situation where an individual is being verbally confronted and aggressively approached in a public parking lot, but there is no immediate physical contact or overt display of a weapon by the aggressor, what is the most prudent and legally sound course of action for a Kentucky Concealed Deadly Weapon License (CCDW) holder? Option A. Maintain a defensive posture, verbally de-escalate the situation if possible, and assess the immediate threat to life or serious bodily injury before considering any action. Option B. Immediately draw the concealed weapon and issue stern verbal commands to deter the aggressor. Option C. Turn and walk away quickly without engaging or assessing the aggressor's intent. Option D. Draw the concealed weapon and confront the aggressor, demanding they leave the area. The correct answer is A. Maintain a defensive posture, verbally de-escalate the situation if possible, and assess the immediate threat to life or serious bodily injury before considering any action. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the handling of potential threats by licensed individuals in Kentucky. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate judgment under pressure, balancing the right to self-defense with the responsibility to avoid unnecessary escalation and potential legal repercussions. A licensed individual must not only understand the law, but also apply it ethically and prudently in dynamic situations. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of the immediate threat and the legal justification for drawing a concealed weapon. This means evaluating whether the individual's life or the life of another is in imminent danger of death or serious physical injury, and whether there are any reasonable means of escape or de-escalation available. Kentucky law, specifically KRS 503-050, use of physical force in self-protection, and KRS 503-070, use of physical force in protecting other persons, along with the requirements for a concealed deadly weapon license, CCDW, emphasize that the use of deadly force is a last resort. A licensed individual is expected to act with restraint and only when absolutely necessary to prevent death or serious bodily harm. Therefore, maintaining a defensive posture and verbally de-escalating while assessing the situation aligns with the legal and ethical standards for responsible concealed carry. An approach that involves immediately drawing the weapon and issuing verbal commands without a clear and present danger of death or serious physical injury is problematic. While the intent might be to deter, it can be perceived as aggressive and may escalate the situation unnecessarily, potentially leading to unintended consequences or legal scrutiny. This fails to meet the high standard of necessity required by Kentucky law for the use of deadly force or even the brandishing of a deadly weapon. Another unacceptable approach is to retreat immediately without assessing the threat. While avoidance is generally preferred, Kentucky law does not impose a strict duty to retreat when faced with an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury, in a place where the individual has a legal right to be. Completely disengaging without any attempt to assess the situation or de-escalate, if safe to do so, might be seen as a missed opportunity to resolve a situation without further confrontation, though the primary focus remains on avoiding unnecessary force. Finally, drawing the weapon and making aggressive, accusatory statements without a clear and imminent threat is a significant failure. This demonstrates a lack of control and judgment, potentially provoking the other party and creating the very danger the license is intended to defend against. It violates the principle of using force only as a last resort and with proportionality to the threat. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and de-escalation. This involves constantly evaluating the environment, the behavior of others, and the imminence of danger. If a threat is perceived, the individual should consider all nonviolent options first, including verbal commands delivered calmly and assertively, and the possibility of safe disengagement. Drawing a weapon should only be considered when the threat is immediate and severe, and all other options have been exhausted or are unavailable. The decision to draw or use a weapon must be justifiable under Kentucky law, focusing on preventing death or serious physical injury. Question 16. System analysis indicates a Kentucky resident is applying for a concealed carry deadly weapon (CCDW) license and needs to provide proof of residency. Which of the following documentation combinations best satisfies the Kentucky statutory requirements for establishing residency for this purpose? Option A. A recent utility bill from a previous Kentucky address and a valid out-of-state driver's license. Option B. A current, valid Kentucky driver's license and a recent utility bill showing the applicant's name and Kentucky street address. Option C. A Kentucky voter registration card and a bank statement with a P.O. box listed as the mailing address. Option D. A post office box rental agreement and a copy of the applicant's social security card. Correct answer is B. A current, valid Kentucky driver's license and a recent utility bill showing the applicant's name and Kentucky street address. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to accurately recall and apply specific legal requirements for obtaining a Kentucky concealed carry deadly weapons (CCDW) license, particularly concerning the documentation needed to prove residency. Misinterpreting or misrepresenting residency can lead to license denial and potential legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure all submitted documentation is valid and meets the strict criteria set forth by Kentucky law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to provide documentation that unequivocally establishes Kentucky residency as defined by state law. This involves submitting official documents that bear the applicant's full legal name and current Kentucky street address, such as a valid Kentucky driver's license or state-issued identification card, and a recent utility bill or lease agreement. This approach directly addresses the statutory requirement for proof of residency, ensuring the application is complete and compliant with KRS 237-110. Incorrect approach is analysis. Submitting a post office box as proof of address fails to meet the legal definition of residency, which requires a physical dwelling. Providing a utility bill with a previous address, even if recent, does not demonstrate current residency in Kentucky. Presenting a voter registration card from another state is irrelevant to establishing current Kentucky residency and indicates a potential misunderstanding of the application requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach application processes by thoroughly reviewing the specific legal requirements of the governing jurisdiction. When in doubt about acceptable documentation, it is prudent to consult the official statutes or contact the issuing authority for clarification. A systematic approach, ensuring each piece of documentation directly satisfies a stated legal criterion, is essential for successful and compliant applications. Question 17. Which approach would be most aligned with the responsible and lawful practice of carrying a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky, considering the nuances of public perception and potential for misinterpretation of actions? Option A. Focusing solely on whether the firearm is technically concealed and the location is not explicitly listed as prohibited, without considering the manner in which the weapon is carried or its potential impact on others. Option B. Thoroughly understanding Kentucky revised statutes regarding concealed carry, including prohibitions and definitions, and ensuring actions are not perceived as threatening or intimidating, even if not explicitly brandishing the weapon. Option C. Relying on personal judgment of what constitutes reasonable behavior when carrying a firearm in public, assuming that as long as the permit is valid, actions are permissible. Option D. Prioritizing the convenience of carrying the firearm in a particular manner, even if it might draw attention or be perceived as unusual by the public, as long as it remains concealed. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly understanding Kentucky revised statutes regarding concealed carry, including prohibitions and definitions, and ensuring actions are not perceived as threatening or intimidating, even if not explicitly brandishing the weapon. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to demonstrate not only knowledge of Kentucky's concealed carry laws, but also the ethical judgment to apply them in a nuanced situation. The applicant must understand the distinction between carrying a firearm for self-defense and carrying it for purposes that might be misconstrued or violate specific prohibitions. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with KRS 237, 110, and related statutes, which define permissible concealed carry and outline prohibited locations. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding of Kentucky revised statutes, KRS, regarding concealed carry, specifically focusing on the definition of deadly weapon and the prohibitions outlined in KRS 237, 110, 12. This approach prioritizes adherence to the letter and spirit of the law, ensuring the applicant's actions are unequivocally legal and ethically sound. By understanding that carrying a firearm in a manner that could be perceived as brandishing or threatening, even if not explicitly stated as such in the immediate context, could lead to legal complications or violate the intent of the concealed carry permit, the applicant demonstrates responsible gun ownership. This approach involves self-awareness of how one's actions might be perceived, and a commitment to avoiding any behavior that could be interpreted as reckless or unlawful. An approach that focuses solely on the technical definition of concealed, without considering the context or potential for escalation, is professionally deficient. While the firearm may be concealed, carrying it in a manner that suggests intent to intimidate or threaten, even without overt brandishing, could be interpreted as a violation of the spirit of the law and potentially lead to charges under other statutes related to public order or menacing. This fails to account for the broader responsibilities associated with carrying a deadly weapon. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to assume that as long as the firearm is not actively being displayed, the location is not explicitly listed as prohibited, and the permit is valid, all actions are permissible. This overlooks the potential for actions to be construed as threatening or intimidating, which can have legal ramifications beyond simple concealment. The law expects responsible judgment, not just technical compliance. Finally, an approach that relies on personal interpretation of what constitutes reasonable behavior without consulting the specific statutes and case law governing concealed carry in Kentucky is also flawed. Legal compliance requires adherence to established legal standards, not subjective opinions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive review of all relevant Kentucky revised statutes pertaining to concealed carry, including prohibitions and definitions. This should be followed by an assessment of the specific circumstances, considering how actions might be perceived by others and whether they align with the responsible and lawful use of a deadly weapon. When in doubt, seeking clarification from legal counsel or law enforcement is a critical step in ensuring compliance and maintaining professional integrity. Question 18. Investigation of a traffic stop in Louisville, Kentucky, reveals that the driver possesses a valid Kentucky Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons (CCDW) license. The officer observes no signs of impairment or other illegal activity. What is the best professional approach for the officer to take? Option A. Ignore the presence of the concealed weapon since the driver has a valid license and proceed with the traffic stop as if no weapon were present. Option B. Ask the driver if they feel threatened and if they have any reason to believe they need to carry the weapon, implying suspicion of their intentions. Option C. Immediately order the driver to exit the vehicle and surrender their firearm, citing the inherent danger of a concealed weapon. Option D. Politely request to see the driver's CCDW license and identification, verify its validity, and if no other violations are observed, thank the driver and allow them to proceed. The correct answer is D. Politely request to see the driver's CCDW license and identification, verify its validity, and if no other violations are observed, thank the driver and allow them to proceed. Explanation. Investigation of a potential violation of Kentucky's Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons License, CCDW. Regulations presents a professionally challenging scenario due to the sensitive nature of firearms and the strict legal framework governing their carry. Officers must balance public safety with the rights of licensed individuals, requiring meticulous adherence to established protocols and a thorough understanding of the law. The scenario demands careful judgment to distinguish between lawful conduct and potential offenses, ensuring that enforcement actions are both effective and legally sound. The correct approach involves a measured and evidence-based response, prioritizing de-escalation and thorough investigation before any punitive action. This approach begins with a calm and professional interaction with the individual, clearly stating the reason for the stop and requesting to see the CCDW license and identification. If the license is presented and appears valid and no other violations are observed, the officer should thank the individual and allow them to proceed. This aligns with Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, Chapter 237, which outlines the requirements for carrying a concealed deadly weapon and the conditions under which such carry is permitted for licensed individuals. The emphasis is on verifying compliance with the license terms and ensuring no immediate threat exists, thereby respecting the rights of a lawfully licensed carrier while upholding public safety. An incorrect approach would be to immediately assume guilt or intent to misuse the weapon based solely on the presence of a concealed firearm. This could manifest as an aggressive or accusatory demeanor, demanding immediate surrender of the weapon without establishing probable cause for such an action beyond the mere fact of concealed carry by a licensed individual. Such conduct violates the spirit of KRS 237 and could lead to an unlawful stop or seizure, infringing upon the rights of a licensed citizen. Another incorrect approach is to overlook potential indicators of impairment or unlawful activity simply because a valid license is presented. While a license permits concealed carry, it does not grant immunity from other laws, and officers have a duty to investigate any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, including driving under the influence or other offenses. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with observation and assessment. Upon encountering a situation involving a concealed weapon, the first step is to identify if the individual possesses a valid Kentucky CCDW license. If a license is presented, the next step is to verify its validity and assess the individual's behavior for any signs of impairment, threat, or other unlawful activity. This systematic approach ensures that actions are justified by evidence and legal authority, rather than assumption or prejudice. Question 19. Assessment of a Kentucky resident's understanding of concealed carry regulations. A valid CCDW license holder is attending a public community event held within a municipal building that has security personnel present but no explicit signage prohibiting firearms. Which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to Kentucky's concealed carry of deadly weapons license, CCDW requirements? Option A. Carrying a concealed deadly weapon in the municipal building. Assuming that since it is not explicitly listed as a prohibited location in KRS 237, 110, and has no explicit signage, it is permissible. Option B. Assuming that a valid CCDW license grants unrestricted carry privileges in all public spaces, except those specifically enumerated as prohibited in KRS 237, 110. Option C. Proactively identifying and avoiding carrying a concealed deadly weapon in any location explicitly prohibited by Kentucky law, such as courthouses or schools, and exercising caution in other potentially restricted areas. Option D. Carrying a concealed deadly weapon in the municipal building, relying on the presence of security personnel to deter any potential threats, thus justifying the need for self-defense. The correct answer is C. Proactively identifying and avoiding carrying a concealed deadly weapon in any location explicitly prohibited by Kentucky law, such as courthouses or schools, and exercising caution in other potentially restricted areas. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with strict adherence to Kentucky's laws regarding the carrying of deadly weapons. Misinterpreting or disregarding the nuances of the Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons License, CCDW, regulations can lead to severe legal consequences, including license revocation and criminal charges. The core challenge lies in understanding the scope of permissible carry locations and the specific prohibitions outlined in Kentucky Revised Statutes, KRS, Chapter 237. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of KRS 237, 110, which details prohibited places for carrying a concealed deadly weapon, even with a valid CCDW license. This statute explicitly lists locations such as courthouses, correctional facilities, and schools. Therefore, the correct approach is to proactively identify and avoid carrying a concealed deadly weapon in any location explicitly prohibited by Kentucky law, regardless of personal perception of safety or the presence of security measures. This aligns with the legal obligation to comply with all statutory restrictions associated with the CCDW license. Incorrect approach is analysis. Carrying a concealed deadly weapon in a location not explicitly listed as prohibited by KRS 237. 110, but which is a government building with security personnel, is an incorrect approach. While not explicitly forbidden by the statute, government buildings can fall under broader interpretations or specific signage that may prohibit firearms, and the presence of security personnel indicates a heightened awareness of security protocols that should be respected. This approach risks violating implied prohibitions or local ordinances that supplement state law. Carrying a concealed deadly weapon in a private establishment that has posted signage prohibiting firearms, even if not a location specifically listed in KRS 237. 110, is also an incorrect approach. Private property owners have the right to prohibit firearms on their premises, and failure to adhere to such posted signage constitutes a trespass and a violation of the property owner's rights, which can lead to legal repercussions separate from CCDW violations. Assuming that a valid CCDW license grants unrestricted carry privileges in all public spaces, except those explicitly listed in KRS 237. 110 is an incorrect approach. This overlooks the fact that the license is subject to numerous restrictions and prohibitions, and that other laws or regulations may apply to specific locations or circumstances. It demonstrates a lack of comprehensive understanding of the legal framework governing concealed carry. Professional reasoning. Professionals seeking or holding a Kentucky CCDW license must adopt a proactive and diligent approach to understanding and complying with all relevant statutes and regulations. This involves not only memorizing the list of prohibited places, but also being aware of potential implied prohibitions, private property rights, and the importance of respecting posted signage. A commitment to continuous education on firearm laws and responsible carry practices is essential for maintaining legal compliance and ensuring public safety. When in doubt about the legality of carrying in a particular location, the safest and most professional course of action is to refrain from carrying the weapon. Question 20. The monitoring system demonstrates that a Kentucky Concealed Carry of Deadly Weapons (CCDW) licensee has fired 3 rounds from a standard 10-round capacity handgun during a recent training exercise. The licensee is preparing to reholster the firearm. What is the most accurate method for the licensee to determine the remaining ammunition capacity in the firearm for immediate readiness? Option A. Estimate the remaining ammunition based on a general visual assessment of the magazine. Option B. Focus solely on the total magazine capacity of 10 rounds, disregarding the number of rounds previously fired. Option C. Assume the magazine is still at its full 10-round capacity, since the exact number of rounds fired is not precisely recalled. Option D. Calculate the remaining rounds by subtracting the number of rounds fired from the total magazine capacity. The correct answer is D. Calculate the remaining rounds by subtracting the number of rounds fired from the total magazine capacity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge by requiring the licensee to accurately calculate the remaining ammunition capacity of their firearm under a specific, time-sensitive condition. Miscalculation could lead to a misunderstanding of legal carrying capacity, potentially resulting in a violation of Kentucky's concealed carry laws if the firearm is loaded beyond the legally permissible limit for a concealed weapon. Careful judgment is required to ensure adherence to the law and safe handling practices. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a precise calculation of the firearm's total capacity minus the number of rounds already fired. This approach directly addresses the legal requirement of knowing the firearm's loaded state and ensuring compliance with any potential magazine capacity restrictions that might be implicitly tied to the definition of a concealed deadly weapon in Kentucky statutes, although the primary focus here is on the number of rounds. The calculation is straightforward. Total magazine capacity rounds fired equals remaining rounds. For example, if a magazine holds 10 rounds and 3 have been fired, the remaining capacity is \10 10-3 equals 7 rounds. This method ensures the licensee is aware of the exact number of rounds available, which is crucial for responsible firearm ownership and adherence to concealed carry regulations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves estimating the remaining ammunition based on a general feeling or a quick visual check, without performing an exact count or calculation. This is professionally unacceptable because it relies on subjective judgment rather than objective fact, increasing the risk of error. Kentucky law requires licensees to be knowledgeable about their firearm and its capabilities, and such an estimation falls short of this standard. Another incorrect approach is to assume the magazine is still at its full capacity if the exact number of rounds fired is unknown. This is a dangerous and legally unsound practice. It ignores the fundamental principle of firearm safety, which includes knowing how many rounds are in the firearm at all times. This assumption could lead to carrying more rounds than intended or legally permitted, depending on specific firearm configurations and any applicable Kentucky statutes regarding magazine capacity for concealed carry. A further incorrect approach is to disregard the number of rounds fired and only consider the total magazine capacity. This fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of a loaded firearm and the practical implications of its use. The legal right to carry a concealed deadly weapon is contingent on responsible and informed possession, which includes understanding the current state of readiness and ammunition count. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and data-driven approach to all aspects of firearm management. This involves meticulous record-keeping or, in this case, precise calculation based on known facts. When faced with a situation requiring knowledge of ammunition count, the decision-making process should prioritize accuracy and legal compliance. This means performing the exact calculation. Total magazine capacity rounds fired equals remaining rounds. If the number of rounds fired is uncertain, the safest and most legally compliant action is to unload the firearm and manually count the rounds, or to reload with a known quantity if the firearm has been discharged. This ensures that the licensee is always operating within the bounds of the law and with a clear understanding of their firearm status.